Tina and Kualoha had prepared more organized comments. I'm just going to, tell the audience the kinds of prompts I gave you that helped shape what you're going to present. So I wanted to know from them how their work transformed or extended, to use the oceanic metaphor, new waters in indigenous studies, in ethnic studies, as well as feminist studies. I was also curious about certain examples in their work that would bring alive this kind of approach that they take, the ways in which they stretch our imagination about what we can do, thinking about gender and sexuality in the Pacific. And lastly, each of them work across media, and they also work across disciplines. So I wanted them to talk about the ways in which these crossings shape the questions that they ask of their work and the approaches they take. So those were my questions to them.
I wonder if I should just present what I have
Yeah.
here. I wanted to also say, malaga na reconcile I pinetne na Taitano Ginenesti na tano, and that would be the Kanako Maoli people, and I just wanted to acknowledge before I begin my presentation. Much of what I want to talk about actually is draws from the book, as Monisha mentioned. It's a book that looks at the historical and cultural relations between Native Chamorro women and American Navy wives. And my starting point is to really look at Native women's subjectivity in relation to that work. So I look at the way, I'm really interested in looking at the way that certain spaces were reconfigured in, under US colonialism, and the way that Native women worked these spaces. Within that gendered colonialism, and the Navy called this the long road to rehabilitation. It called its benevolent, the project in Guam, the colonizing and modernizing project in Guam, the long road to rehabilitation. So I look at the way that Native women negotiated those terms. And it's really important to look at that alongside white Navy wives who were doing the same thing. They were complicit with US colonialism and empire, but they were also doing very different and very distinct things. And this is what I call, this is what I actually argue was their efforts to transplant white middle-class womanhood in Guam. And so they were participating in organizing social events for the military, but then they were also doing these other things. One Navy wife, for example, comes to Guam and establishes the first hospital for Native women and children, and then that eventually opens up a Native nursing school, which begins to recruit, and the Navy begins to recruit Native women, and what that means for Native women, these new spaces. So I look at the work of Chamorro women, how they're negotiating colonial modernity, and I look at this in the context of what I'm calling an indigenous placental politics. And I'll get to that well, I'll say for right now, that really comes from the way in which Native nurses, in spite of incorporating modern methods from under the Navy, they were also holding on to traditional Chamorro practices, beliefs, and rituals around childbirthing and pregnancy. And so I explore that as a placental politics, specifically Chamorro, but I'm also interested in exploring how that can, what that can furnish for contemporary indigenous struggles, this placental politics. And I'm talking specifically about the United States military buildup that's going on in Guam right now. So I try to look at this placental politics, and I do this in that forthcoming essay that's coming out of Intersections. Looking at Keith here, he's probably looking at me because I owe him some revisions on that. But this essay that begins to explore the placental politics in relation to the contemporary movement. So I want to turn, to, I just want to share with you some of the archival as well as the oral histories that I did for this project, to give you a sense of the breadth of the kind of things that I was grappling with. I was obviously rereading the archives, but also trying to glean from them other things that conventional historiography doesn't give us. And I was also incorporating oral histories. I had the fortune of the good fortune of interviewing some of the last surviving patera, the nurse midwives. That's a Chamorro term for nurse midwives. And so I want to share with you some of those interviews and you know, have you see for yourselves the way that they were negotiating this colonial modernity. So in looking at this placental politics, I actually follow Chamorro women's mobility. I pay close attention to women's mobility precisely because of the way that women in Guam and the Marianas, in the region of Micronesia, and throughout Oceania for that matter, have continuously and systematically been conceptualized and idealized as bearers of culture and language, as stable and rooted bodies tied to land, familia, and tradition. The colonial and counter-colonial narratives that actually do attend to Chamorro women's mobilities often associate women with cultural or social negligence, betrayal even. I actually, in the book, I'm actually looking at some of the feminist theory around the virgin-whore dichotomy. I'm indebted a lot to Chicana feminist theory here. So this, given the matrilineal genealogies throughout Oceania, and in the case of Guam, given the role of women as Hog and Hogat, blood daughters. Chamorro women's rootedness in land can perhaps be best exemplified in Chamorro cosmology, the more obvious image of the divine for Chamorros in Guam, and that would be the origin story of the Chamorro creation gods Puntan and Fuuna. And there's different versions to the story, but the more common one is that Fuuna separates her brother's body parts, and with one of his eyes creates the sun, with the other the moon. With Puntan's eyebrows, she creates the rainbows, and with his back, the earth. With her powers, then she brings life to her brother's body parts, and she throws herself on the land, her body eventually becoming Fuha Rock. And this is an image of Fuha Rock in the southern part of Guam, and you all would have seen this earlier with Austin Shelton's presentation, for those of you who were here earlier. And this is, so this image of Fuha Rock, from which the first Chamorros originate. I want to mark also that it's become an important, it's part of this, what's called in Chamorro Inafat Maulik, a very tadung or deep system of codes and values. And for now, that's all I want to say, but, and I'll return to this in a few minutes. But this is also part of that, and it's exemplified by the fact that Chamorros have actually revitalized that pilgrimage. Historical accounts have talked about these pilgrimages to Fuha Rock, and that's something that's been revitalized in the past several years, recent years rather. So I want to look at 4 dimensions of the embodied labor of these nurse midwives, the patera. One is, the first one is so it's an image of the nurses that were recruited into the nursing school in the 1930s. So the first, that first dimension of the patera labor, the embodied labor, has to do with the way in which they were able to transgress these spaces that ordinarily women, young women, the Navy was recruiting young women, these spaces that were against proper Chamorro prescriptions around, what's right and what's wrong. And so these women were beginning to transgress those spaces. Secondly, it was the way in which they negotiated the spaces. So they were not only crossing, but the way in which they were able to come back. And the way that they were able to, massage those points of tension around what the Navy was teaching them around childbirthing and pregnancy. And so a third part would be the way that these Chamorros hybridized. I put that in quotes. I know that's a very fraught term, but really the way that they were mixing modern Chamorro methods with traditional Chamorro age-old practices. And I'm going to get to that in a second. And then fourth, the way that they handled compensation. This is one of the patera that I interviewed. who has since passed on. And she, I think here, if you read along here, many of these women gave the interviews in Chamorro, and then these interviews were translated into English. But as you can see here, these women became suspect by their kinfolk. If they had expressed an interest in becoming nurses, they would, in the worst case scenarios, they would be labeled as whores or putas in Chamorro. And I actually use the term palawansalan, keeping up with, kind of thinking about that idea of mobility and what that mobility means. I also wanted to share with you this particular, this is part of the archival research I did at the Navy Archives in San Bruno. And what's really interesting about this is it's just one page of a 4-page, of the 100 names of people who have their, this is a registration of vehicles, there's only one name that's identified. There's only one woman who actually has access to a car, and this would be a nurse midwife. So that speaks to that mobility, that very privileged space, right? Not a lot of women are in that space, and this is a nurse midwife. So she would be like the 5th or 6th name up there, Maria Aguero, who became a very prominent partera. And that third dimension where I talked about, hybridizing and mixing, I think this is a really good example of the way that these women were able to negotiate or massage those points of tension. There's actually a lot of other examples that I give from these interviews, but here we have Tan Rosalia or Tan Liang talking about finding it very Maulic good advice, and she's really talking about, she's telling the women, if you want me to deliver your babies at home for all these other reasons that you give me, like being mamahlau or embarrassed to go to the hospital, seeing the hospital as these sites of death, you have to do this for me. You have to go through the prenatal checkup so that I can be able to deliver your babies at home. So she begins to articulate this progress along Chamorro terms is how I argue it. And so the word Maulic is really key here because it's part of that system of Inafat Maulic, this Chamorro system of upon which many values and codes are built, right? And so that's really key here. The last, that fourth dimension that I talked about, what I really want to say about that, whoops, excuse me, has to do with compensation. And this was a really interesting one. The Navy stipulates that Chamorro midwives are supposed to charge between $2.50 and $10 for a delivery. And these women are not, they're not doing it. I mean, what they're doing is they're getting paid in terms of produce, right? Things from the ranch. And the Navy's, they're saying, you don't have to deliver the babies. In fact, we want to encourage you, and this was their efforts to make Guam a cash-based economy. And so they're refusing that, they're resisting that. And I situate that as part of this placental politics, right, is really identifying your work in relation to the community and to the land and to stewardship of that land. And I hope that, I'm going to talk about Agata Johnston, who is actually known as Guam's godmother of education, to give you a sense of what that godmothering and stewardship would look like with respect to land. But one other point I wanted to make about compensation was that many of these women would get paid, if not in produce. The women whose babies they delivered would actually name them, dub them, would call them, would ask them to be the godmother of their kid, right? And so that's a kind of reverse way of compensating, right? If you think about compensating, you're supposed to charge someone for your services, and you're actually kind of absorbing the cost. But for those of us who are godparents, we know what that's about, right? And how much money is involved in that. So that's another way that these women are actually kind of militating against the Navy's efforts to make Guam a cash-based economy. Another woman, Chamorro woman that I look at who comes under the Navy is Agata Johnston. And she's not a native nurse, she's a teacher, but again, thinking about these mobilities, she's a teacher, administrator, experiences upward social mobility in proximity to Chamorros, but also the military. And so I look at how she negotiates that. But what really becomes the turning point for Agata Johnston is the moment in the post-war years where the military starts to condemn Chamorro lands, and she becomes really vocal about that. In conventional histories about Agata Johnston, she's highly praised. People love her, and she's known as the patriotic Chamorro. But I give a little bit more complicated history about Tanagata, and I explain how it is that as godmother of education, and she actually becomes a godmother of all sorts, and that godmothering takes the form of stewarding the land and speaking out against the military. So I want to go ahead and stop there because I kind of gave a lot of things, but yeah.